This is the Mondoweiss Podcast. I'm Dave Reed. Today we're excited to share an episode from the Latitude Adjustment Podcast, looking at the role Christian Zionism plays in the continuing persecution of Palestinians. Eric Maddox completed his graduate research in conflict transformation from Dheisheh Refugee Camp in the occupied West Bank, collecting oral histories from the 1948 war. He is the founder and director of the Palestine Podcast Academy and the host of Latitude Adjustment Podcast. He interviewed the Reverend Dr. Don Wagner, a friend of Mondoweiss, an expert on Christian Zionism. If you want to hear more from the Latitude Adjustment Podcast and the Palestine Podcast Academy, check our show notes for links.
This is Latitude Adjustment, and I'm your host, Eric Maddox, coming to you from Napa, California. Latitude Adjustment highlights underrepresented communities, places, and perspectives from around the world through interviews with people working on the front lines and at the grassroots. A Christian theologian, former minister, and author, Don Wagner received a Master of Divinity from Princeton Theological Seminary and a Doctor of Ministry degree from McCormick Theological Seminary. He was director of the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Chicago's North Park University. He served as national director of the Palestine Human Rights Campaign from 1980 to 1989, was director of Middle East programs for Mercy Corps International from 1990 to 94, and was co-founder of Evangelicals for Middle East Understanding. He's the author of 5 previous books on Palestinian rights, but today we will be focusing on his latest, Glory to God in the Lowest, Journeys to an Unholy Land. Don's book and today's conversation will focus on the phenomenon of Christian Zionism. It will also focus not only on Don's journey away from this deeply racist and distorted interpretation of the Bible, it will focus on my own journey away from Christian Zionism as well. While Don provides an extraordinarily comprehensive overview of the origins and the aims of the Christian Zionist movement, it might be helpful to offer a quick summary for those who are unfamiliar with the topic. While there have been different strains of Christian Zionism dating back several centuries, the most politicized, powerful, and violent iteration of the movement has its roots in the contemporary Christian Evangelical Church. In brief, modern Christian Zionists hold that the ethnic cleansing of roughly 750,000 Palestinians from their homes in historic Palestine in 1948 by Jewish Zionists was the fulfillment of a biblical prophecy in which the so-called Holy Land must be resettled by the Jewish people in order to usher in the return of Jesus Christ as the Messiah. Modern Christian Zionism is distinct from the modern form of political Zionism that arose amongst the European Jewish community in the late 19th century. Modern Zionism, that is, not Christian Zionism, was led largely by European Jewish secularists who held that a modern nation must be created for the Jewish people as a refuge from increasingly harsh and violent strains of anti-Semitism in Europe. Theodor Herzl, an Austro-Hungarian journalist, is widely regarded as the father of modern political Zionism, with his seminal work on the subject, The Jewish State, published in Vienna in 1896. Contemporary Christian Zionism in the U.S. evangelical Christian community is worthy of particular consideration for the tremendous political power it wields over U.S. politicians, its effort to persecute defenders of Palestinian rights, and for the enormous amount of money it funnels to support Israel's violent settler colonial confiscation of Palestinian lands. It also holds tremendous sway over U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East more broadly, playing a key role in lobbying for the U.S. invasion in Iraq and the more adversarial strains of American policy towards Iran. And as we'll go into in our conversation, far from being sympathetic to Jewish suffering in the past or the safety of the Jewish community in the present, Christian Zionism has been and remains a violently anti-Semitic expression of white supremacy. What's more, all forms of Zionism have faced strong opposition from the rabbinate since its inception, and we encourage you to listen to episodes 88 and 89 of Latitude Adjustment Podcast, featuring interviews with 2 anti-Zionist rabbis about the distinctions between anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. What follows in this episode is not only an analysis of theology, history, and international politics, but a discussion of the surprisingly parallel journeys that Don and I took as we uncovered the chilling truths behind our indoctrinations into Christian Zionism. What is Christian Zionism, for starters? And more specifically, can you talk about the 2 main expressions of Christian Zionism and what their aims are?
Well, I grew up in both in different phases of my life. The first is the most familiar one, evangelical fundamentalist Christian Zionism. And that is, the simplest definition is Christian political support for the Zionist movement in the state of Israel. And usually I would add for that one, it sees the state of Israel as a fulfillment of biblical prophecy and calls Christians to provide theological, religious, and material support for that state. And it's very political. And I make that distinction because when I first began to write about this and research it, I went all the way back to the Reformation, Protestant Reformation, and you could see themes there for calling Christians to support of Israel, but they were mainly theological or evangelical.
What years are we talking? When was the Reformation, just for people that don't know their history of Christianity?
16th century. And you saw...
So this is Martin Luther.
And others. And there's an early movement in the early 17th century in Holland calling for support of Israel and for Christians to rally around that. But it mainly developed in Britain. And, the Restorationist movement was one where they called for Israel to be restored as a country to bring on the second coming of Jesus. And that continued to be very strong in the 19th century, particularly in England. But then the one that we're most familiar with is the dispensationalist movement, which grew out of John Nelson Darby and others, that really saw Scripture as predicting the return of Jews to Israel, a Jewish state, and then the whole scenario with the rapture, the rise of the Antichrist, Armageddon, and so on. And this became very popular, but it too is primarily theological. And in my memoir, I've tried to make a distinction between the precursors of Christian Zionism, that means those that prepared the way for Christians to support Israel, both the Restorationists and the Dispensationalists. And then when it becomes political, when Zionism rises, and that is in the late 19th century. I point to two examples. One is a Reverend Heckler, who was the chaplain to the British forces in Vienna, and he made a direct connection with Herzl, and he saw Herzl in the Zionist movement as a fulfillment of prophecy. And then he became very active politically with Herzl, connecting Herzl. First, he tried with the German Kaiser and then with the Ottoman Empire to try to create land so that Herzl's project would, in fact, be sponsored by a major power and land would be granted to it. They failed, but that is a direct political type of support. So that's distinctively different.
I think a lot of people in our audience are going to know who Theodor Herzl is, but maybe you can give just a brief bio of who he was.
Yeah. Well, Theodor Herzl was a journalist and a playwright, and he was a secular Jew who was asked to cover the Dreyfus trial in Paris in the mid 1890s. And this was a Jewish French colonel who was framed and convicted by the French courts. Herzl covered that for a Viennese newspaper. And when he walked out of the Justice Building in Paris, he saw a crowd screaming, "Get the dirty Jew!" And he felt, here's the most progressive country in Europe. We will not be safe anywhere. And then he turned completely to the whole Zionist movement. Now, there were a number of figures before Herzl who were saying that because of anti-Semitism, we need a state of our own. We'll never be safe in Europe. But Herzl picked that up and turned it into a movement. And then he convened the First World Zionist Congress in 1897 in Basel, Switzerland. So Reverend Heckler supported all of that. So it was very political. Now, at the same time, in the United States, you have a very clear political development with a William E. Blackstone, who is from the Chicago area where I live, Oak Park. He was a disciple of Dwight L. Moody, the great evangelist, and he wrote a book in 1876 called Jesus is Coming. But then he saw that he had to really move that into a political dimension. So in 1891, he formulated a petition drive to call upon then President Harrison to create a Jewish state in Palestine because of the pogroms and the suffering of Jews in Europe. So that was, and this petition drive was sponsored by major financiers, and it had ads, and it had the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, many senators, appealing to Harrison to create a Jewish state, which he did not do. But Blackstone continued that, and in Lord Brandeis, who was the Supreme Court Chief Justice and Jewish and head of the Zionist movement in the U.S., declared him the father of Christian Zionism and a great lover of the Jewish people. So he was honored, and there are two clear examples of evangelical political support of the Zionist movement, working with Herzl and the Zionist movement to create a Jewish state. So those would be my illustrations.
And the last example that you gave, this evangelical support for Herzl, were they motivated by this like end times prophecy and trying to get Jesus to return?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and this was William E. Blackstone's background. He believed in dispensational theology. This end time, the prophecy was moving toward a support of a Jewish state, and that the Antichrist would rise. It would be the rapture, Armageddon, and the whole 9 yards, which we can get into more if you wish. So those are the two evangelical aspects that I would point to. And actually, they're part of the fundamentalist movement. Evangelicalism is a broad category. I mean, it's over. It's a huge movement with many variations. I mean, you have the Sojourners movement and many other progressives who basically are not Christian Zionists and support justice for all. Are very much involved in anti-racism, nonviolence, and so on. But these movements are kind of the fundamentalist wing of the evangelical movement. And, they're about 20%, some say 18% of the overall evangelical movement in the United States. But I would add, they are growing exponentially in South America, Central America, Africa, and Asia. That's where the major growth is now. And Israel is maximizing that support. And they love Netanyahu, and they support Israel unconditionally, and are very strong political proponents of the Zionist movement.
If you can, really quickly, because we covered a lot of history and a lot of different expressions of Christian Zionism, can you, before we go on to discuss the other forms of Christian Zionism, can you briefly summarize or categorize what you've already covered? Yeah,
I think, this is kind of a new analysis for me. When I first began to write about Christian Zionism, any of the early movements, be they theological, restorationist, or others, or dispensational, I categorize them all as Christian Zionists. But because of the rise of the Christians, of Zionism being a political movement, I've made this distinction to kind of narrow the focus a little bit. So with this evangelical political support directly with Herzl and the Zionist movement, that is a shift for me. And so that this is evangelical support, political support for the state of Israel, pretty much unconditionally. And they use theological, but even tourism and organized political support. And John Hagee and the Christian Kufi, Christians United for Israel, would be a clear example. The Christian Embassy in Jerusalem would be another example. And this is the movement that's growing rapidly across South America, Central America, Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. So that's kind of the summary.
And is the strain that's growing globally, like even across the global South? These are all expressions of evangelical Christianity. This isn't Catholicism or Orthodoxy, or
right. Primarily that, right. Now, I go ahead with the second form is developed later, and it was a response to the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. And it really develops during World War II. And, let me read a definition that I use in the book. That mainline Protestant and Roman Catholic Christian Zionism support the Zionist movement and views the state of Israel as the answer to the Holocaust and security against anti-Semitism, thus guaranteeing the Jewish people an independent Jewish state in historic Palestine. So, and this grew in the run-up to the creation of the state of Israel with the UN partition in 1947. But figures like Reinhold Niemann, where he had a progressive, liberal Christian Zionist lobby that lobbied Truman and the U.S. government heavily in support and cooperated closely with various Zionist organizations, supporting not one secular state, which was one of the proposals that the U.S. and others were entertaining, but the creation of a Jewish state in partition. And so Niebuhr and others actually lobbied on behalf of the Jewish state, as opposed to one secular democratic state for all.
And when you say for all, I assume you mean Christians, Muslims, and Jews and Arabs. And
exactly. Yeah. Everyone in that state would be equal, so it would be kind of a democratic model.
Yeah.
Now, an important thing to remember is the Zionist movement grew as a reaction to anti-Semitism in 19th century Europe. And it followed a model for nationalism, which is called blood nationalism, a Jewish state for the Jewish people, where all others would be secondary. Or you might say, Germany for the Germans. So it's kind of it's based upon ethnicity and so on. So that's the model that Zionism followed, and that's what Herzl picked up. He was not interested in Palestinians being included. In fact, many of his quotes, there's one where he states, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, "We will spirit the penniless population out and provide for them for their exit in other neighboring countries." He basically, kind of embraced a form of settler colonialism. That we will,
and ethnic cleansing.
Ethnic cleansing, absolutely. And that's in early Herzl. Now, he played both sides of that. He would talk about, okay, we're going to be democratic, include rights for everyone. But the bottom line was no. He wanted an exclusive Jewish state for the Jewish people. And that's what he got.
I would describe this as ethnocentric nationalism.
Absolutely. It is. You can describe it as a form of apartheid, which it has become, and that's very much in the debate today. But it is a ethnocentric nationalism rather than a democracy where everyone will be equal in that state.
So let's get into, you've alluded to your book already a bit, but let's get into it a bit more specifically. So what informed, first of all, your choice of titles for the book? So let's clarify what your book's called and why you chose to call it what you did. And then who is its intended audience?
Yeah, the title is Glory to God in the Lowest, Journeys to an Unholy Land. And it's kind of a theme that you see in the Gospels and in the Hebrew prophets, that Jesus came for those who were suffering. Even he, born in a humble manger, and the enunciation of his birth is glory to God in the highest, but actually it's very lowly, and this is intentional. The family became refugees, and throughout his ministry, he was always reaching out to those in need and emphasized that, whether they be lepers or the poor, feeding the hungry. So his whole ministry really was to those at the margins, but it was really also for everyone at the same time. So glory in the lowest is kind of, I think, what we are called to do by the Hebrew prophets and by Jesus' actual ministry. And Matthew 25 is really kind of, I think, the strongest text for that. Where were you when I was in prison? Did you visit me? When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was thirsty, did you give me drink? Even though you do it unto the least of these, my brethren, you do it unto me. I think that's a very clear statement of glory to the lowest. And as we serve in partnership with those in need, we are doing the work of the gospel. And certainly the Palestinians are getting the short end of the stick in the Holy Land. In fact, they've been ethnically cleansed and have suffered. And I think it's a call to Jews, Muslims, Christians to work together to kind of bring liberation. So liberation theology becomes very important for me in terms of articulating this.
Who do you want to read your book? Who's it directed toward?
Well, I've tried to have multiple audiences in mind. Certainly to evangelicals. I describe my journey of being a Christian Zionist from, kind of that evangelical end time theology. So certainly that would be one audience I'd like to have read and see this progression, this transformation, but also to mainline Protestants, Catholics, Orthodox Christians. So there would be those three audiences. And then really to anyone, secular folks, my Jewish friends. I've done a couple of Zoom calls with synagogues. And it's a call for a partnership where we can work together. And many of them are very interested. How did Christian Zionism evolve? And how can we stand and challenge it? And Muslim friends. American Muslims for Palestine is a group I work closely with. And it's a fast-growing, wonderful advocacy group now. And they're quite interested in Christian Zionism and what it means and how we can overcome it. So there's really, three categories of folks. So I'm trying to reach out, in a broad way.
For my part, my journey away from Christian Zionism, something that I was just indoctrinated with as, I think, an 11-year-old during the first Gulf War. I was just taken aside in my church by, I think, not even a pastor, just like a lay person, but an active member of the church, and given this kind of crude presentation on why it was my patriotic and Christian duty to always support Israel no matter what. And then with some cherry-picked verses from the Bible illustrating why it was foretold in prophecy that Israel would be without any allies and that the U.S. was its last ally, etc. And I wasn't political. I was 11. I didn't know anything. And I just kind of accepted that, an older person who is supposed to be someone that I listen to, a moral authority, person of standing in the community, is telling me what the right course of action is. I should probably follow it. It wasn't something that was really discussed ever around the dinner table at home. It was something that really I experienced on my own, independent from my parents. And when years later, I found myself in the Middle East and also just studying issues more closely and starting to understand the politics a bit. It was seeing the disconnect between precisely what you're talking about, key chapters in the scripture, and then seeing that wasn't in any way informing what was playing out on the ground in Palestine, and then wondering I'm not seeing very Christ-like behavior toward the Palestinians. And this doesn't seem to fit well with the story of the Good Samaritan or the idea of love thy neighbor as thyself. I wonder what your personal history is with Christian Zionism. You've alluded to it a little bit already, but that's a bit of my personal history. There's a lot of details I'm leaving out, but what's your personal history and your walk away from it?
Well, mine's very similar. And my parents, however, my mom particularly, and my grandparents, maternal grandparents, were very much followers of the end time theology. And when my dad was in World War II, my mom and I moved back in with my grandparents. And I got this same kind of thing as a young man, a young boy. And I remember going to a revival. My grandparents took me to an old country revival where the evangelist was preaching this whole theology. And at the end of his sermon, and like I hadn't heard these things from around the dinner table from my parents and my grandparents, but at the end of his sermon, he said, Jesus could come back at any moment. We know we're in the end times because Israel now has been established as a state. The Antichrist is alive. The rapture will be next. And I want you to come to Jesus tonight. So he gave the altar call. And I was kind of so shaken by all this. And he had all the things of the lake of fire and that you'll be left behind and suffer. So I kind of made a little prayer in my heart and confessed, yeah, I believe Jesus, but I didn't go forward. And then the next morning, I didn't sleep well that night. I was really kind of shaken. So I came down late and my grandmother wasn't in the kitchen fixing breakfast as usual. So I ran around looking for her. There were even ladders in the trees where they were picking cherries. It was July. And no workers, but they were there the previous day. So I thought I had been left behind because I didn't go forward. So it's kind of a fear-based theology that really grabbed me as a kid. And I kind of like you, I saw the light maybe when I was in junior high, and it just didn't square with the Jesus I was reading about in the Gospels. So, but it's a powerful narrative. And I understand because I was there. So anyway, so that was my experience. So that, that kind of shaped me. And then later I got the other type of Christian Zionism in seminary, studying the Holocaust and reading, kind of the death of God theologians, and then the post-Holocaust theology, which gave me a liberal version of it, but very, very different.
So what informed your walk away from it?
Well, from the evangelical version, I remember I was at a youth rally in Buffalo, New York, where I grew up, and the preacher gave the usual end time rapture and rise of the Antichrist and come to Jesus kind of appeal. And he asked for questions afterwards. And I said, the rapture is debatable. There's only one or two verses in Thessalonians that refers to it. And to make this a historical event just doesn't seem consistent. Jesus didn't teach it. And then I just raised a couple other verses. And what he said to me was, son, just believe the Bible as it's written and don't question it. And that just turned me off. And I think then I moved away from that theology. Now with the other one, with the more liberal, I held those views as a pastor coming out of seminary. And in fact, our churches twinned with synagogues and worked together on behalf of Zionism in the state of Israel. And I was very much into that. But I had not heard the Palestinian narrative clearly until I was at a church in Evanston, Illinois as a pastor, and we agreed to hold a series on the Arab-Israeli conflict. And this was probably before you were born, early 1974, when we were in gas lines. So everybody was angry with the Arabs. So it's a good time for a course. And the layperson I was working with had settled Palestinians in the 1950s in refugee camps. And he said, we need to at least hear the Palestinian narrative. So we brought in a Palestinian, he was actually the head of political science at Northwestern University. He told his story of being run out of Jaffa with his family in 1948 and gave a compelling personal experience of what happened in Palestine with the Nakba, which I had never really heard. And that scrambled my whole view about the whole justice narratives and what happened to the Palestinians. And that was the beginning of my shift. And then I went over and saw it in person and heard those stories. And that over a 3-year period, it just shifted my whole narrative, my understanding of the Nakba and what was going on. And also how to look at the U.S. policy in the Middle East from, say, Beirut, Lebanon, and the refugee camps. So it was a total transformation for me.
Yeah, I would say that, again, there are some very parallel experiences that we've had in our walk away from Christian Zionism as well. I mean, for me, I was already questioning things a bit because it was my second time going to the MENA region when I was a graduate student in Palestine, in the West Bank. I'd been to Egypt and Lebanon prior to that and had heard those perspectives on how wars with Israel had impacted their communities.
What years were you there?
Let's see. The first time I went to the region was 2002, almost exactly a year after the 9/11 attacks, and those events are connected. It was my questioning, what's going on in quote unquote that part of the world. Like, I just kind of saw it as this uniform block, and I had a bunch of problematic Orientalist notions about what the Middle East was and about the culture and religion, and found myself confronted with my own ignorance repeatedly when I would have conversations with Arabs, and specifically Muslim Arabs in Egypt and in Lebanon. And they asked me questions I couldn't really answer. Yeah. And I thought, wait a minute, I'm the one who's coming from the free country with the free press. I'm supposed to I'm supposed to have all the answers. Mm. And one of the things that occurred to me slowly through these encounters was that, it's not enough to have a quote unquote free press and a First Amendment if people don't have the courage to actually speak the truth. And I think there's a lot of misdirection, misinformation, and just outright propaganda through omission and perspectives that are being left out in coverage of what's happening in Israel, Palestine, and frankly, the global South more generally, and U.S. media. So I started to be confronted with that reality, and it just set me on a path of questioning. In graduate school, I met a Palestinian guy, and he recruited me to come and live in his camp for my research phase.
Whoa!
And so that's how I wound up in Dheisheh in Bethlehem.
Well, yeah.
And at that point, I was already fairly well on my path to questioning, but still a little bit of like a both sides mindset. Mm-hmm. I would definitely not where I'm at now, which is anti-Zionist, pro-BDS.
Yeah, that's quite a change.
Like this project, like Zionism has got to go. It's a racist project. I wasn't quite there yet. Mm-hmm. I was still finding my way, but by the time I left Palestine, I had changed pretty radically. I was arguing with IDF soldiers in the streets in various cities in the occupied West Bank. And also, as someone who looks like they could be from the region, had my own encounters with various people on both sides making presumptions about my identity.
Wow.
Sometimes it would be Palestinians assuming that I was Jewish, and sometimes it would be IDF people assuming that I was Palestinian, or just I got asked a lot, like, where are you from? And when or what are you doing here? I would ask the Israelis, well, what are you doing here? I was invited. Right?
Yeah.
I'm going up the street to go have some tea. I've got an invitation, man. You're in occupied Hebron, Al Khalil. So yeah, it's just seeing the reality on the ground. It's pretty hard to deny the severity of the abuse and the structural racism And frankly, if there is such a thing as evil, the evil that's being done to an entire population, amongst them innocent children,
and often in God's name.
Yeah, very often. And I was very often asked my religion by Israeli military officials in various occupied contexts, and I would just say, "Why do you need to know? Why does it matter? Am I more deserving of humane treatment if I'm one religion or the other?" And it was just this back and forth. And I was like, this is not a question that I was familiar with being asked in the U.S. in order to get access to a building, So, yeah, it was just seeing just the blatant injustice of it all. And also while I was there, a 19-year-old kid in the camp was martyred.
Wow.
And just seeing how the impact that had on the community and attending that funeral. And going to the protest in Bil'in, like just outside of Ramallah, which is like this weekly Friday protest that's been going on for forever, and I think is still occurring. And just seeing how quick the Israeli forces were to just fire tear gas canisters straight at our heads. Yeah, like there was no intention of using this non-lethal force the way that it was supposed to be deployed. Like somebody right next to me was hit in the head, and was
I've been there.
Was wounded, and I found out later that people were being killed at this protest using tear gas canisters.
Yeah, and it's a completely nonviolent protest, against an illegal wall taking their property.
I mean, my eyes aren't in the back of my head. At a certain point, after I saw tear gas being shot at us, like literally tearing the branches off trees, a person next to me was hit in the head and just like their clothes caught on fire from whatever propellant was inside these tear gas canisters, which may well have been made in the U.S. I don't know. I know that the U.S. sells that stuff everywhere. Palestinian kids did come out with like their slings, which are symbolic form of resistance. They're completely ineffective against well-equipped military force. And I didn't see any provocation. And I was told before this event, I stumbled into the protest site, not really knowing if I was there or not, because I showed up early. And I stumbled into like this cluster of Israeli commandos who were like hiding next to a bush. And they just stepped up in front of me and they asked me like what I was doing there. And I just said, kind of just completely stunned. I didn't see them coming. Just said, I'm here for the protest. Do you know where it is? And so they actually told me like, yeah, you're going to be on that side. We're going to be on this side. But come and talk to us when it's over. And then very quickly, once the protest started, again, just with people there was a guy in a wheelchair holding a flag, like completely non-threatening. Yeah. And I quickly realized there's going to be no opportunity to go up and ask for the other side point of view, because they're actively engaged in possibly lethal violence against us. Right. Like what?
And that gets at the whole issue of, this is not two equal sides.
Not at all.
That are in this struggle. And I kind of avoid, and I've learned this, calling it a conflict.
Yes, agreed wholeheartedly.
Because conflict often assumes, two equal sides and parity. But, the Palestinians have no navy, no air force. They don't control their own land and airspace. Even they don't even control their resources, what's under the ground. They are completely occupied. Whereas the Israelis they have nuclear weapons, maybe the fourth strongest army in the world, strongest in the Middle East, an efficient air force, navy. It's not two equal conflicts.
And it's not an argument. It's not a misunderstanding. It's an occupation.
Right.
It's ongoing ethnic cleansing.
It's a political struggle with ethnic cleansing by one side.
Yeah, I think that's really important to point out, that a conflict does, just the word itself, imply that there's some sort of misunderstanding that needs to be worked through. There's nothing confusing about an illegal occupation. It's just the solution is it needs to end. I tend to describe it more as not a conflict, but the relationship between a jailer and a political prisoner. And there can be no good faith negotiation by either side, if you think about it, until that power dynamic changes. Or it's more like the relationship between a torturer and the person who's being tortured and trying to extract a confession from them. I mean, at a certain point, someone might relent under torture, under duress, and tell you what you want to hear. but that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be a binding agreement.
Right.
So for me, if there's going to be any real forward movement, obviously the occupation is a non-negotiable. It's just immoral, politically unsustainable, and illegal, and needs to end. And then maybe there's an opportunity for a conversation once both sides are on equal footing, which they certainly aren't now. The U.S., going back decades, has made it clear that it wants Israel to have, I believe this is a direct quote, like a strategic edge regarding its access to military hardware and intelligence.
Absolutely.
Provided by the U.S. And that's not just with regards to the Palestinians, but everyone else in the region. They get the best of the U.S. Armaments, and also have the best deals where they're allowed to actually take U.S. money and develop their own military-industrial complex, which they can then take the drones that they manufacture and other like surveillance technology and then market it back to the U.S. and other countries.
Exactly.
Which is a way of exporting the occupation and apartheid.
Yeah, the U.S. has a strategic, they always call Israel our strategic ally in the Middle East. And the lobby uses that language, and most of our members of Congress believe it and support it. But the U.S. basically, in all the peace negotiations, and Oslo is the latest and the worst, they kind of put the thumb on the scale and support Israel and allow Israel to continue to steal land, kill and murder Palestinians, and push them out of the country, into the other regions, expel them. So the peace process is a misnomer. It has not been a peace process. It's been furthering the occupation and leading Israel into an apartheid situation. And it's really bad for the Jewish people in the long run. And now we're beginning to see that come apart. It's going to take a long time, but the challenges, such as Ken Roth being denied a position at Harvard Kennedy School, has kind of exposed the whole issue, just because he carefully described and laid out what apartheid is politically. He was denied a position.
Yeah, and just to clarify for our audience, he's the former director of Human Rights Watch,
right,
like going back, I think, close to 30 years. I do believe that they just reversed that decision.
They reversed it. And I don't know what he's going to do, because he's also been granted a position at Pennsylvania. He's got an impeccable career. He happens to be the son of Holocaust survivors and is Jewish, which makes it also very interesting. To be declared an anti-Semite. And he's a very careful researcher and writer, but he's come to this position that Israel is in a dangerous apartheid place and needs to be challenged.
I want to get into how Christian Zionism became the powerful political movement that it is today. And I get that also entails discussing how it became the powerful religious movement that it is as well. And in a way, I understand it, at least in the U.S., to be more powerful than traditional Zionism. To give you an example, I believe it's the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Ron Dermer, who said, and I'm paraphrasing, that Christian evangelicals are a more reliable source of support for the Zionist project than Jewish Americans are. Jewish Americans are starting to question, and have been for some time, the viability of the Zionist project, whereas Christian evangelicals, there's more of them, which can mean more, translates to more money and power, and they're just ideologically a more consistently reliable bloc for Israel. So that's in itself speaks volumes, that you have people who are not Jewish that are pushing this political project with possibly even more significant force than the American Jewish community. How did we get to this point?
Yeah.
How did it get to be so powerful?
Well, I think I've tried to write about this and analyze it, and I'm not sure I have all the answers. But if you go back to the early 1970s, Christian Zionism was around, but it wasn't even called that at the time. And gradually it evolved so that the Christian embassy was formed when Israel annexed most of the West Bank and expanded Jerusalem up near Ramallah and down through just north of Bethlehem. So a lot of embassies pulled out of Jerusalem and went to Tel Aviv. But a group of Christian fundamentalists said, we are going to have an embassy for Christians and support Israel because Israel is the apple of the eye of God, and we will devote ourselves unconditionally to support Israel. So they were the first to use the term Christian Zionism, although it kind of was around. And then you had the rise in the U.S. of movements like the Moral Majority with Jerry Falwell, Pat Robertson's 700 Club, and so on.
This is like the 1980s, is that right?
Late 70s,
okay,
into the 80s. And one of their major platforms was Israel and supporting Israel unconditionally. And they were coming from an evangelical dispensationalist base pretty much. And so it became very strong politically, jumping ahead. And then you have John Hagee from this fundamentalist church and Baptist church in San Antonio having a night to honor Israel, where he would deliver to a major Israeli leader, like the ambassador to Israel in the U.S. would come and be handed a check for $2 million to use unconditionally, however they wanted. And gradually, CUFI aligned itself closely with the main Israeli lobby organization, AIPAC, American Israel Political Affairs Committee, and they began to work very closely in the 90s. And then CUFI just expanded to the point today where it has organizations, if not offices, in every state in the country. And they became a major force. So I'm summarizing quickly a movement from the 70s to the present time, working hand in glove with the pro-Israel lobby. I don't like to call it a Jewish lobby because it's Christian, and there are many Christians now in the lobby. And as Dermer said, there are more of them now than there are Jews because many Jews are questioning the direction Israel is going, especially Jews under 40. In Chicago here, we've become close friends with the AntiZionist Synagogue. And that is remarkable. That was never around before.
Which synagogue? I'm just curious.
It's called Zedek, Tzedek, which is justice or righteousness in Hebrew.
Who's the rabbi?
Rabbi Brant Rosen.
Yeah, I interviewed him on the show.
Oh, great. Close friend. And they have decided, they took a vote to be an anti-Zionist synagogue based upon their reading of Torah and Scripture and what justice calls of them. And I think this is going to grow and expand. So you've got this movement now challenging Zionism and the lobby. And so Israel has turned more to the Christian Zionists. I was my wife and I took a small group, and we were in Bethlehem in October. And we arrived around the 9th or 10th of October and went to breakfast in Bethlehem Hotel. And there were 400 fundamentalist Christians from the Philippines there having their own kind of rally. And I walked by one morning just to see what was going on when they were having their Bible study. And the pastor was standing up front in a pulpit. And the only symbolism was the Star of David on the pulpit. Clearly Christian Zionists. And they were there to partner with the International Christian Embassy in their annual March on Jerusalem. So that, there you go with the internationalization of this movement. So Israel is reaping benefits of tourism, of financial contributions, but political support in each country. I mean, Bolsonaro, who was just deposed in Brazil, was a strong Christian Zionist. And Brazil has a powerful movement. And most recently, a number of Christians had a conference in Santiago, Chile in early November. And they brought in Reverend Mitri Raheb, the the political scientist Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian to analyze Christian Zionism from a Palestinian perspective. And this was done in Chile because Christian leaders and political leaders now see this dangerous trend toward Christian Zionist political influence in their countries, which is very authoritarian. So the international dimensions of this is, kind of scary. But there is pushback coming.
And also noteworthy that Chile, I believe, has the largest Palestinian population outside the Middle East.
Yes, they do.
There is something revealing that you have these right-wing authoritarian regimes scattered in Latin America, strains of it in North America, across Europe, that see Israel as kind of a successful expression of what they're trying to achieve themselves. And that in a lot of these circles, you would think like these strident racist forms of Christianity are traditionally anti-Semitic, in my experience.
They are.
But so there's an irony in the fact that like they ally themselves with Israel. But from what I can best guess is that they see this is a successful ethnic cleansing project. This is a successful ethnocentric nationalist project. And in that sense, it's a blueprint for what we want to accomplish at home. It's not that there's any particular affinity for Jews or Judaism. It's just that this group of people whom certain sects of Christianity historically show nothing but animus towards see an affinity for their political project. Yeah. And that's where there's common ground. Well, on the surface, it might seem a little bit strange. Yeah. Does that seem like a fair summary to you?
Oh, it certainly is. I remember having a conversation with the government of Israel's director of religious affairs raising this issue. And this was about 1985 in Jerusalem. And I mentioned to him, I said, I wonder what your take is on supporting the International Christian Embassy, giving the red carpet treatment to Falwell and Robertson and now John Hagee, bringing these right-wing Christians who really are very anti-Semitic at the core. In fact, the Jewish people play just a bit part for them in their scenario. Theologically, 2/3 of the Jews will die in the final battle leading up to Armageddon. And then Jesus returns and will ask the Jews to convert to Christianity. So I said, that's the scenario. He said, oh, yes. He happened to have been a convert and had attended seminary. So he knows this both as a Christian and as a Jew. He said, we know it very well, but we love their political and economic support, but we keep them on a short leash. So it's kind of a user-friendly arrangement. And every now and then, Hagee or someone else will make an anti-Semitic remark. They're chastised and called upon. They repent, and it goes on. But it is really a dangerous alignment, and it's and like I say, it's growing with the most repressive regimes. But it really just exposes the morality and the inconsistency of both the Hebrew prophets' teachings and of Jesus. So I think that's the ground we need to work.
It does seem in many ways like this unlikely marriage is one of convenience, and it's a transactional relationship between these right-wing Christian movements and even political leaders and the state of Israel.
And we saw it very clearly during the Trump administration.
Oh, yeah.
Probably the most pro-Israel president after Reagan in the U.S. history, moving the U.S. embassy, violating international law, changing U.S. policy, and using the Christian Zionists to build that political support and that movement. And then Trump himself said in a political speech when he's running in 2020, he said this in Wisconsin somewhere, I think La Crosse, okay, I need your support now because we gave you support for Israel and moved the embassy. Now I need your support for my reelection. Very clear, wide open. But there was, the anti-Semitism was reeking all over the place from that administration. But it continues.
I mean, I don't want to ask you to speculate too much here, but I do have questions about the cynicism on both sides.
Yeah.
And I mean, from the Israeli side, like it seems pretty straightforward. It's look, like we'll pay lip service to whatever crazy theology you're preaching, because we get material benefits from it. We get political cover. We get money and weapons at the end of the day. And while you pressure the U.S. government to sign off on our racist political project. But I mean, do you think people like Reverend Hagee even believe what they're saying? Because is there something beyond the ideological that's motivating them?
No, it's hard to judge that. I think once you get into that narrative, as you and I both were, it creates kind of some blinders. That when you accept that narrative, that history and prophecy are moving toward the creation of an Israeli state, the rise of the Antichrist, Armageddon, and the rapture, we're going to be conveniently removed. So it's a nice convenience because of the rapture. But many of them are true believers. And a lot of them are in my family. I have difficulty changing people's minds. My mom kept saying to me, "Why do you work on justice for Palestine? This won't be solved till Jesus returns." She had that end time thing going. And I never could convince her. But my dad saw the light. And he broke away from all that. And I think we just have to plant the seeds and make sure that we are consistent in our own theology. And I think the most important thing is to build partnerships. Intersectionality is kind of a buzzword I'm getting a little tired of. But I think it's important that we build relationships and partnerships with Muslims, with these progressive Jews like Zedek and others, with secular folks, and build a movement for justice and truth-telling. And Christians becoming critical and very aware of what Christian Zionism is doing in the dangerous direction it's taking both Israel and us. We got a lot of work to do, but I think to work in partnership is the most important thing we can do.
So speaking of movement building, I'd like to broaden our scope, pull back a little bit, and just look at this project of trying to dismantle settler apartheid colonial structures like Zionism in the context of like the wider movement for social justice worldwide. Let me phrase it this way. Like, speaking as both a Christian and as a humanitarian, why do you find Christian Zionism to be uniquely problematic? Why focus on this? Or as I've heard many people say when I've criticized Zionism and Israeli policies towards Palestinians, like, why do you care so much about this little country? Like, what's the big, like, there's other issues in the world. There's other dictatorships, right?
Right.
Why are you devoting so much of your time and energy to Christian Zionism?
Well, I guess I'd lay out a number of issues. I've alluded before to my reading of the Gospels and the Hebrew prophets. Justice for all is at the core of what what Jesus was teaching and doing, and the prophets were raising. And they challenged the state, the government. And one of my concerns about Christian Zionism is it kind of inverts the whole covenant relationship. It really becomes heretical when it applies to a nation state or a political project authority. So, for example, Falwell would often say, he would quote Genesis 12:3, "I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and through you will all be blessed." He kind of twists it a little bit, but he politicizes it. He said, God gave the entirety of Palestine to the Jewish people. And the moment we become a little critical and not believe that, God will punish us. So in a way, he's reversing the covenant relationship. God is the one that initiates that relationship. If you read the Bible carefully, you'll see that Israel is, they're given the land, but they are called to follow Torah, to love your neighbor, the sojourner in your midst. And when you begin to murder, covet, take in land, and steal, you've created kind of an idolatry of land. You make up your own political system, do what you want. God is no longer the Lord of your history and of your land. So it's a heresy. That's what I'm getting at. It takes a bit of the truth and turns it and creates an idolatry so that the land, the state, the nationalism becomes primary. And that is what Israel always suffered and struggled with. So you have verses that correct that, even in Leviticus 18:19, that the land can be lost. There's a verse that says, if you violate the Torah, the land will vomit you out. And they jump over that. They jump over the justice of Jesus and miss all of that, what I think is the heart of the gospel and the prophets. To love God first and love your neighbor as yourself.
From what I recall of Scripture, and also what I remember of the history of opposition to Zionism, I mean, a lot of the rabbinate going back to the beginnings of like modern Zionism, not Christian Zionism, but like Herzl's Zionism, like there was a lot of pushback and still is from Orthodox Jewish communities and the rabbinate, precisely because it was conceived of as a secular project, and that the reestablishment, if it was going to happen, of Israel was supposed to be done exactly as you said. Like this was supposed to be, God was supposed to initiate this, and that anything that's conceived of by secular interests is heretical.
Exactly.
It also calls to mind, and please correct my misquoting because it's been a while since I read it, but I think it's in 1 Samuel. This is like when the Israelites say that they want to have a king. They want to be like other nations. And so this is where Saul comes from, and then ultimately David and Solomon.
Yes.
And that this was a moral lesson, right? That we saw like how flawed Saul was, and even David, right? Like the most beloved, right?
Man after God's own heart, it says.
Yeah, exactly. And Solomon also, like what his last words were, like all is vanity, right? So, So you have this example of, even in the Scripture itself, the problems that arise from wanting to be like other nations, right? And then setting that against what you've said about like the misapplied or misinterpretation of the Torah in a way that actually inverts it and makes it into this political project.
Exactly. No, you're exactly right. That, I mean, those discussions of the monarchy in 1 Samuel are very clear, and it even says in one of the texts that, remember, the king may turn you into slaves. The king will use you, and no longer will God be sovereign. So it isn't like saying don't have a king, but there's a danger, there's a risk when you politicize it, that the monarchy, the project, will become unethical. And you always have to remember that God is Lord and is the judge. And that's what the prophets, Amos, Micah, the rest, were calling people back to. Correct the error of your ways, or you are going to suffer and lose, the land and the kingdom. And that happened, with the captivity, first with the northern states, Samaria, and then later with Judah, where they were carried into captivity. And the rabbis interpreted that we were wrong. We no longer honored God as Lord. And therefore we brought suffering upon ourselves. So that was the judgment. But yeah, and we have this, so it continues today. And I think that's what Zedek, this synagogue in Chicago, is raising up, that justice and only justice is what we should focus on, and then get involved and try to correct and change. And then, when you do, we pay a heavy price. It's not easy to be prophetic about these issues.
And I want to get into that too, what the barriers are to trying to push for change and for justice. But I also kind of want to summarize a bit also this question of why Christian Zionism and Zionism itself are problematic, and that it's not really just about this tiny country in the Middle East, that it's actually the impacts of this settler colonial project is felt far beyond the borders and the not clearly defined borders of this one little country. And for one example, when Israel normalizes ties, like under the so-called Abraham Accords with places like Morocco or places in the Gulf, what you find happening very quickly and conspicuously is that these countries start having access to Israel's spyware technology.
Pegasus.
And so one of the deal sweeteners, so looking at it that way, is that they're given the tools. If you want to play nice with Israel, we'll give you the tools to more effectively oppress your own people.
Exactly.
And so then you see how insidious it is to normalize occupation and racism, because one of the things that allows that project to sustain itself is the relationships that are formed with other countries that don't criticize it and then benefit from the technologies that Israel's been able to produce. So its impact is felt far beyond the borders of Israel itself and the parts of Palestine that it's occupying. It's felt by Moroccans. It's felt by not just Emiratis, but if you look at the Emirates, the majority of the population there are not citizens and are even easier to exploit. So this would be one of, at least my answers to my own question, would be that it's not just about Zionism's impact in Israel and on Palestinians. It's that other people are being oppressed in order to maintain that state. Does this resonate with you?
Yes, I agree totally. And, Israel becomes, quote, the successful model of how to ethnically cleanse your population and then control them. And it's exported to, and then the Israeli military has been used in Guatemala, all over South America. And the Christian Zionists then come along and they normalize and support that kind of oppression. And so it really is a conundrum that Christian Zionists are normalizing settler colonialism, all these security devices, and forms of nationalism that are absolutely repressive, and it's exported around the world,
including to U.S. cities. Right? You have either current or former Israeli police officials teaching American police departments and population suppression tactics, like how to basically riot policing. And so you could very well, like the person that's putting the knee on the neck of somebody in your neighborhood anywhere USA may have been trained by an occupation force from Israel, right?
Exactly.
And so the occupation itself is being marketed.
Yeah.
That it's quote unquote battle tested and proven. And that battle testing and proof is its effectiveness in suppressing and oppressing the Palestinian people and denying them human rights. And then it could be deployed. So when people ask, like, why do you care so much about what's happening in Israel? It's that, well, those same tactics, that same technology can be deployed on American streets, or pick a country, right? Israel has a very strong relationship with India at this point. Supposedly the world's largest democracy, although the direction that country is going is its own podcast. It's become its own fascist problem.
Yeah, going back to the military, the militarization of our police forces, clearly the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, has promoted police going to Israel to be trained by the Israeli military. And then you have military approaches to crowd control, which is what Israel does for the Palestinians. And we had the same thing in Chicago. So now there's a project. We work together with Black Lives Matter and others to challenge this. And we're being forced, because of the oppression and the killing of young black men and women were being challenged to find other methods of not just crowd control, but police-community relations and things that are a little bit more humane, but to get away from the Israeli model that they've refined on Palestinians, particularly in Gaza. And, and the use of Israeli weapons. Israeli weapons are field tested in Gaza every 2 years in their incursions on Gaza. So the latest then can be said, these have been field tested, they're successful. And then the Israeli arms dealers, can claim, these are successful weapons because they've been field tested on Palestinians. And then that's exported all over the world. I saw a recent survey from the Emirates and the Gulf Arabs, where one of the questions was, do you support Israel having normal relationships with the Emirates? And the overwhelming majority, 2/3, 3/4 of the population said no. But it's the monarchy, the political leaders, who do not have the support of the local people, who are pushing these arrangements to normalize through the Abraham Accords with Israel, which the Biden administration, unfortunately, is also pushing. But the majority of the people do not want it. But that creates a situation where you have to control your local population. But that will create an explosive situation when these people rise up against it. So it's unhealthy, but that's the direction things are going right now.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that the same has been true for decades with regards to Egypt's treaty with Israel.
Right.
That it was never popular on the street. This was always a top-down initiative. You alluded to a few minutes ago about next steps, like movement building, and also solidarity amongst different movements, like such as Black Lives Matter. So let's get into that a bit in terms of what obstacles people face. So what obstacles do U.S. and European politicians, activists, human rights defenders face if they criticize Christian Zionism or mainstream Zionism? And how can we deal with the inevitable attacks that seem to come? I mean, it's almost like a script at this point. Like, you're going to be accused of anti-Semitism first, sympathy for terrorism, etc. So how do we deal with the inevitable bad faith argumentation and smear campaigns that are going to happen if you start to question the direction that evangelical churches are taking in support of Israel, for example?
Well, just to begin, it'll go back to Ken Roth and his experience at Harvard. And here, the Harvard Kennedy School, one of the most reputable foreign policy institutions in the country. When you have someone like Ken Roth, a very careful Jewish son of Holocaust survivors, applying for a job and being offered it, and then he loses it because he had been too critical of Israel, and major donors, it was found, were the ones that raised the opposition and canceled his appointment there. So, and then Harvard, under pressure, because it's clear that a lot of the pressure came from all over the world, academics saying, you are violating our First Amendment rights, you're violating academic freedom. So Harvard then was forced to reverse itself. But there you see the process going forward. This is happening in churches. I mean, I've had that in my own experience. I had it at my university when I was a professor, where when I was raising a critique of Israel's attack on Gaza, use of phosphorus weapons in 2008, major pro-Israel lobbies and Christian lobbies went after our administration to have me removed, and eventually I lost my position. And the administration took a firm position saying, there's no outside pressure. But we were able to prove there was outside pressure, both from Christian Zionists on the board and from pro-Israel lobby organizations. So when you critique it, you expect it. you're going to get pushback and opposition. In academia, so many have lost jobs. I mean, I was a minor figure. Norman Finkelstein, a Jewish son of Holocaust survivors at DePaul University in Chicago, lost his position under an organized attempt because of his criticism of Israel's record and direction. Stephen Saleta, a scholar, had a position. He moved his family from Virginia to Champaign to the University of Illinois. And then the pressure came because he had tweets opposing Israel. And his job was rescinded. And he has been left to fend for himself. Now he's teaching in Egypt, I believe. So it's very hard in academia. It's even harder, I think, on our political officials, our senators and members of the House. However, the cause is not hopeless. We worked very hard, my wife and I, with some others, to get a congresswoman elected. She lost her first run in our congressional district. With the Palestinian Friends, we educated her on Palestine. Her name was Marie Newman. She took a very strong stand on human rights. She challenged Israel in terms of expansion of settlements. She supported the Bill 2590, I think it is, to end Israel's practice of detention and torture of Palestinian children. When she went up to run in the last, when her congressional district was redone, she lost to a very moderate Democrat, Sean Casten, where AIPAC and others pumped in millions of dollars to defeat Marie because of her position on Palestine. So she was out. But she will run again. She's not going to give up. So it's a real uphill battle. But I think, in a way, the extremism of the Netanyahu government is helping us a little bit, that we can point very clearly to the apartheid dimension and the settler colonial practices that Israel has that violate U.S. policy and international law. We have something to work on now, and we have to do it intersectionally with the Black community. And the Black churches are being lobbied by the pro-Israel lobby. So we have an uphill battle there. The Presbyterian denomination, that happens to be mine, has really taken some very bold stands. They issued a call for people to contact their members of Congress to cut aid to Israel in direct proportion to the violations of human rights. That coming from a denomination. But then there's opposition within a denomination to that. But there are openings now, and I think we have to work in partnership with Jewish, Muslim, Christian, secular friends, to really pursue these agendas and know we're going to have losses, but it's going to take a long, long time. So I'm hopeful that, I won't see it in my lifetime. I will not see a shift in my lifetime, but I know it's coming. And I think we have to just work in partnership and know this is our calling. We need to be, we won't be successful, but we need to be faithful to what our ethics, what our scripture teaches us, and for me, what the ministry of Christ models.
It raises a question for me, too, about where the actual battleground is to change policies and actions in Israel. That the real battleground, in a way, you could argue, is the U.S. It's like how much agency do Israeli politicians even have?
Yeah.
When you have people like the late Sheldon Adelson and other huge donors pumping money into right-wing political parties and projects and politicians, and also underwriting right-wing media in Israel. So in a way, you have the U.S., and not just as a government, but just people from the U.S. as donors pumping money into supporting the most perverse versions of an already perverse ideology. And how much control do Israeli politicians, in a sense, even have over their own destiny? Like, they're having to appeal to those most right-wing voices in the U.S. and those most right-wing interests in the U.S. in order to secure funding so that they can continue to hold power in Israel.
Oh, absolutely. There's, some of the Ben Gviv, who was, a pro-Kahana supporter and is in Netanyahu's government. So he's one who...
This is a political party that's, I think, listed as a Israeli political party that is outlawed, I think, in Israel, listed as a terrorist organization, I think, by both Israel and the U.S.
Yeah, no longer in Israel. It's been normalized. So they're in the government now. But the Kahana party were accused of terrorism and being a terrorist organization in the United States. But he raises a lot of his funds in New York and Brooklyn and sustains it that way. And that's something I think we need to work on. This is a project I wish I had the money to figure out. How can we challenge the tax-exempt status of some of these illegal organizations or a group like Kufi, who is giving money to settlements directly and getting a tax-exempt break from our IRS codes? There's a discussion going on how those loopholes can be closed. And that's one of the places of attack I'm really interested in. You have churches in Colorado and California of raising funds to support settlements like Ariel in the West Bank, sending groups over, all raised with tax-exempt money. This is a violation of our IRS codes because you are violating international law and supporting the theft of land from the Palestinian people. But they get away with it. So it's a very difficult, delicate situation. I've been told there is movement on this, but members of the Congress are going to be afraid to touch it because it would be a hot item. They would get under such pressure from those that accuse them of being anti-Semitic because you're cutting funds to Israel and this is a blood libel. But it has to come. So here is something that's a very clear project, open-ended. We got many examples of how it violates both our own government policies and international law, but it continues. So that would be one way to get at it that I'm very interested in supporting. But just to raise these issues is another case. And gradually, I think there's going to be, as Israel tends, and this is a dangerous direction, Israel is headed for the cliff because of, just the basic direction of stealing land, eventually bringing people into government who are calling for the mass expulsion of Palestinians. And it's pulling the mask off of seeing what Zionism really has taken Israel to. That it's a secular ideology of ethnic cleansing and apartheid. And the critiques are now coming out more vociferously. And whether it's from the churches or not, we have to stand by and really be willing to pay a price to tell the truth. So, that's kind of where I am. I'm retired now, and it's I don't have to worry about basically, normalizing things. I can be more prophetic in what I say, but it's. I look back on my career 40 years ago. We didn't have a group like Jewish Voice for Peace. We didn't have an AntiZionist Synagogue. We got stronger partners now than ever. The Muslim community was not organized even 20 years ago. Now they have their own lobby organizations, and they are full partners. Our denominations, Presbyterians, United Church of Christ, Episcopalians, they have justice movements working on all of these issues that we didn't have, even 10 years ago. So that's encouraging, but the power that we're dealing with is so monolithic and so entrenched in our own government that it's going to take years to undo it, but it is underway. And we need to take courage and be hopeful about it.
I want to take a step back and discuss a bit of history. What is the connection between Christian Zionism and anti-Semitism and white supremacy, both historically and up through the present, which we've already touched on a little bit, like this alignment of right-wing Christian leaders and their affinity for Israel's apartheid policies as kind of a blueprint for them to follow. But what's the history? For example, like if I can just cite an example that might be an entry point, Lord Balfour of the infamous Balfour Declaration that is kind of held up by many Zionists as like this foundational document saying that, look, the British looked with favor upon the founding of a Jewish national home, specifically not saying nation, because they knew they were playing both sides and had also promised this land to the Arabs as well. But Balfour is looked at as like, he was a Christian Zionist. He's looked at as being this like kind of seminal figure in like the establishment of the state of Israel. But he was also an avowed anti-Semite and a white supremacist. So how do you square those two things? And correct me if I've got anything wrong here.
No, you're exactly right. In 1905, Balfour opposed a bill before Parliament. He was a high-ranking member of the Parliament in Israel. He opposed a bill to settle Jews who were fleeing the pogroms.
You said Parliament in Israel, but I think you meant he's a parliamentarian in the UK. In the UK,
British Parliament. Sorry. He opposed that, but at the same time, he was interested in the Zionist project of settling Jews in Palestine. So he did not want Jews living next to him in his neighborhood, but it was convenient that Jews would be settled elsewhere. So his anti-Semitism, in a sense, was driving some of that policy. But Balfour was educated in Sunday schools that taught the end-time theology. He bought into it. And he was really a colonialist and a settler colonialist. He wanted the empire to advance and grow so that the British Empire would expand from the Eastern Mediterranean all the way over to the jewel in the crown, which was India. So he had this colonialist view, and he knew that if the British would support the Zionist movement would be indebted to the British and would be favorable to them, rather than the 92% Palestinian majority who, when they were making these deals and the Balfour Declaration was being discussed, Palestine was 92% Christian and Muslim, much smaller number of Jews. So they decided not to support the majority because they couldn't control them. But they would create a situation where that majority would certainly be second-class citizens and deposed eventually. So the Zionist movement was part of their imperial expansion, and that's why they supported them. But very anti-Semitic. David Lloyd George, who was the prime minister at the time, was the same way. He was raised in Christian Zionist background. And I remember reading an analysis of his work with the treaties that settled World War I, that his advisors were trying to convince him so that he would negotiate well, but his memory of the geography was only the Bible, biblical names of Hebron and so on. He was so locked into a Christian Zionist narrative, he couldn't grasp the politics of it. So that's who you were dealing with. And, so the whole Balfour Declaration was that Her Majesty's government will basically give away Palestine to the minority Zionist movement, who was a very small and unpopular movement, as you mentioned earlier. But the Palestinians, who were 90 to 92% of the population, would be secondary. Their name isn't even mentioned in the Declaration. So it's a very I mean, it was a very classic understanding of settler colonialism. Now, the British supported, the support right on up into the 40s of rapid expansion.
Yeah, I do think that it's really important for people to understand that where there's consistency between I see Zionism is really just, and Christian Zionism is really just an extension of white supremacy. That it follows a lot of the same blueprints. It has the similar project as far as colonialism, imperialism, and, well, in the case of Israel and South Africa, apartheid. And that the consistency is that people like Lord Balfour, who I believe was the former foreign secretary of the UK, for them it was, to put it crudely, we're happy to see Jews settling Palestine because it means you won't be here.
Exactly.
Right. And if we can and if it's consistent with some end times theology that we bought into, and also I think another undercurrent here might also have been just buying into conspiracy theories too, that go back, to protocols of elders of Zion, that kind of thing. And just thinking that, well, these people are controlling the world, so better that we have them on our side. I don't know how much that played into it. Obviously, that's deeply anti-Semitic, but it might have informed their logic.
I'm not sure. I think it was much more that they wanted to expand the empire, the colonial empire. And they were practitioners of colonialism and settler colonialism. So why not have it in Palestine? The embryonic Jewish community would thrive. So we'll support even their settlement, taking land from Palestinians. That's okay. But then it kind of backfired, because then the Zionist militias turned against the British in the 40s. So they paid a heavy price and limped out and turned a failed project of settler colonialism over to the Zionists and the UN. And then the U.S. exercised its pressure on a number of nations. And rather than supporting a one-state solution, which was on the table in front of the Truman administration, but was lobbied heavily by Niebuhr, by many Christians, and by the pro-Israel lobby, and they got partition, which is exactly what Chaim Weizmann, the head of the Zionist movement, wanted. Just give us a foothold, and then we will take the rest. And then you got the Nakba, expulsion of 2/3 of the Palestinian, half of the Palestinian population, maybe a little more, 750,000. And Israel expanded, and it's expanded ever since.
And those Palestinians and their descendants haven't been allowed to return ever since.
Exactly.
Of course. So you've spoken a bit about what actions people can take, both Christians and non-Christians alike, to address some of these problems. Is there anything else that you would like to add before we close? Practical steps that people can take, organizations that they might want to seek out and support or join in addressing some of the issues that we've talked about concerning Christian Zionism and its influence.
Let me just speak of what Christians can do, for starters. Palestinian Christian leadership, the Kairos Palestine movement. Listeners, could really get familiar by just Googling Kairos Palestine and seeing what they are calling for. Friends of Sabeel.
How do you spell that?
Kairos, Kairos Palestine. They have called now for 2 years for an urgent form of pressure from Christian leadership all over the world and their parliaments to end this whole settler colonial movement, to call upon the implementation of international law and human rights, support boycott, divestment, and sanctions for economic pressure. These are Christian leaders who have issued this call, and it's been for the last 2 years consistently. To get,
you started to mention Friends of Sabeel, I think, also, before I cut you off.
Yep, Friends of Sabeel. Just Google Sabeel, Sabeel. It's a biblical term, that means a stream of living water, or the way, what Christians were initially called at Antioch. So there's 2 organizations to take a look at. But also, the Presbyterian denomination, United Church of Christ, they are working together to kind of work on these projects. And another one, I think, is to call for an end of the Israeli practice of the detention and abuse of Palestinian children. Last year, the bill was 2590. It had 35 members of the House. Now it's going to be up for review again because with the new Congress, there's going to be a new number for that bill. And I was just on a Zoom call with Defense of Children International, where they are monitoring, and the numbers are appalling. Every night, Israel raids a home and takes one or two children and detains them without charges, detention. And they can hold them for 8, 9 months, even years. My wife's nephew was picked up when he went down to get a loaf of bread, and the Israeli military were in there, and he got scared. He ran to get home and bring the bread home for dinner. They picked him up. He was in prison for 8 months. No charges. And he was apolitical. He wasn't involved at all. Now he's more political after going through the prison system. But this is, Israel's the only country in the world that detains children and uses military courts to try them. And this practice has to end. So there's a bill. It's illegal. It's patently illegal by international law to apply this to children under 18. And at any time, there's probably 150 of them in prison, and it keeps growing. So that's a very specific bill that we've been called to support and advocate. And to not be bashful, but to raise these issues with our members of Congress. Ask them to be a co-sponsor. Betty McCollum of Minneapolis is the leader of this bill, and she's been very courageous speaking out on behalf of Palestine. And there's a growing number, so we need to grow that so that at least they can have hearings so we could end that practice. So those are a few small things.
I actually did my graduate internship with DCI Palestine.
Wonderful.
And I remember, which I think now is listed as a terrorist organization by Israel, which is patently absurd. They derive their mandate from the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child.
Right.
That's part of when you're referring to the illegality of imprisoning children. And in particular, it should be pointed out, not only are they being imprisoned, subject to administrative detention, I think is what Israel calls it, which is a period of imprisonment without charge or trial for 3 months, but it can be renewed indefinitely and has been used to imprison both children and adults for years.
Yeah, every 3 months it can be renewed indefinitely.
And they're also imprisoning them with adults. So you have children that are being picked up in contexts like what you described, where they shouldn't be picked up ever, period, but they're being picked up on the streets for no reason, and then imprisoned with hardened criminals in some instances, and just the layers of abuse involved in that system where they had these secret military courts. And there's I can't remember his name, but there's a Palestinian young man, I think, who's been imprisoned. I think he just had his 21st birthday in prison, and he's been there since he was like 13 or something.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely obscene. So, I mean, that should be low-hanging fruit.
Yeah, that should be a no-brainer for us.
So obviously,
to stop children being abused.
And Israel is a signatory to this treaty, by the way, to this convention. Like, I think just about every country. I think last I checked, when I was working with DCI Palestine this was 2007, 2008. I think the U.S. and Somalia were the only countries that weren't signatories. Israel is.
Yeah.
So it's tacitly acknowledged the illegality of its own behavior by signing this document and then doing the opposite of what it's mandated to do.
Palestinian Christians are 13% of the overall population of the West Bank, and Gaza. Now they're down to 1%. Why? It's because of the brutality of occupation, loss of land, insecurity, children being picked up and detained, a number of reasons. The economy has rapidly deteriorated. And now a more extreme government, you fear more loss of land, more expulsions coming. So Christians are leaving in a higher number because they can go to other countries, because like Chile, Australia, where there are large Palestinian Christian populations. Muslims have the same abuses, and they don't leave in as large numbers, but they're a larger number of the population, so you don't see it as much. But I think that's something that Christians should be concerned about. And not just because they're Christian, but to do it to end the abuses of all Palestinians. So that should be another motivation for us.
Don, I really appreciate your time. You've been very generous with your time. This has been very, very informative. I've had my own journey away from Christian Zionism. It's been really compelling to hear like how parallel our trajectories have
very
been.
Similar.
Even though we're separated by a generation or two. It's telling also how long this movement has been around and how similar the manipulation tactics are. And like they've basically been the same, like the forms of indoctrination that are so insidious, and that really the tools for deprogramming people are much the same. Like your path toward like freeing yourself from this indoctrination is kind of on a parallel course with mine too. You know, it came from educating myself, seeing the inconsistencies between the realities on the ground and what's in the scripture itself, and also just, you know, experiencing Palestinian culture and seeing how much not just Christian Zionist interest, but also just the mainstream media functions as a propaganda tool to dehumanize whole populations, and perhaps no population more so than the Palestinians.
You know, and for both of us, I noted that Palestinians help educate us.
Yeah.
And I make that very clear in my book, you know, that I was brought through this thanks to Palestinians who mentored me. And I have a huge debt for them. That's one of the reasons I still feel called to this.
Amen. Like this is, I feel I characterize it the same way. And I say the same about Egyptians, because that was my first contact with living in a Muslim majority country and in an Arab majority context. And I just have to reflect on and appreciate the patience that so many people showed me when I know that I showed up with bigotry, really, and with an arrogance about their culture and assuming that I had all of the information. And so many people could have just responded with anger and would have been justified in doing so, given what our country has been doing to them for so long, whether we're talking about Egyptians living under a U.S.-funded dictatorship or Palestinians living under U.S.-funded apartheid. People were profoundly patient with my questions, with my challenges, with my arrogance. And I think they saw me as a work in progress instead of just a lost cause. And for that reason, I feel a tremendous debt of gratitude and also a moral obligation to try and help other people see some of the things that I've seen. I don't call myself an enlightened person, but I'm grateful for what other people have done to help educate me. And I feel like I need to pass those lessons on to others. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, it's been fun sharing this time with you. Yeah,
it's been great, Don. Thank you so much. Where can people find your book?
You can go to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or you can go directly to the publisher. Just Google interlink.com. That's the publisher. And the head of the publishing company happens to be Palestinian, and they've published some powerful books of late. They're telling the truth. So I'm very grateful. So interlink.org, I think it is. It's just $20. So Glory to God in the Lowest is the title.
Wonderful. Don, thank you so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Eric. Blessings.
That's our show. Thanks to Eric Maddox and the Latitude Adjustment Podcast for sharing this program with us. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication with no paywalls. If you would like to support our work, go to mondoweiss.net/donate. Please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find the show. Subscribe to one of our free email newsletters so you can stay up to date on events in Palestine and related politics here in the U.S. and around the world. If you have any more feedback, send me an email at dave@mondoweiss.net. Thanks for listening. We'll be back soon with a new episode.